Well, I'm looking forward to this. It's time now for Mark Meets. Yes, it's time for Mark Meets, in which I speak to the biggest names in the world of politics, showbiz, academia, sport, business and beyond. Tonight we're joined by one of Britain's leading historians, Dr. David Starkey. He's the author of best-selling books such as Crown and Country and Henry, and known, of course, for Channel 4 historic documentary series, including The Monarchy. David is a broadcasting titan as well, who was awarded a scholarship at Cambridge, where he studied Tudor history. He's a winner of the W.H. Smith Prize for Biography and was awarded a CBE in 2007. And he joins me now. Hi, David.
Hello.
David, you had a challenging childhood, but you don't like to characterise yourself as a victim.
I hate the word. Well, you were talking about language before.
Yes.
The word victim immediately punishes you. This is the problem. You embrace victimhood, we see the consequences with Harry. And the profound irony with Harry, he invents a thing called, you were talking about language, he invents those wonderful games called Invictus. Does he know what it means? It means not a victim. Yes. Those men refuse to be victimised by their terrible injuries. He is victimised by the slightest little cherished grievance. I held it in contempt. It was difficult. I was born boring things like club feet.
Yeah, two club feet. You did recover from that, but what were the implications for you growing up with that condition?
The correction was really done by the time I was 4.
That would have been a bit Victorian, I would have thought.
It was Victorian in the sense of how you were treated in hospital. I remember vividly, I was in a male surgical ward. I wakened up with this great cage over my feet in agony in the middle of the night. I can still see the light hanging in the middle of the ward with that strange dark green fabric hanging over it. And the sister came over and said, "Shut up, you are disturbing the other patients."
Astonishing. And your feet strapped to blocks of wood?
No, not that. It was only the left foot, which, because it was going to be much shorter, the left leg rather was going to be much shorter. It was you were saying Victorian. My surgery wasn't. My surgery was part of that revolution which happened because of war. My surgeon, I can still remember his name, a short, little, very tough Irishman called Mr. Kitchen, apparently had learned his skill on crashed airmen in the Second World War. And he did something astonishing. He broke every bone in my leg, below the knee, so that it would be longer. And of course, in those days, there was no such thing as pinning. It was just put in plaster of Paris for months and months and months until this strange, I can still remember the day when it was cut off, this extraordinary white thing with the peeling skin, which hadn't been exposed to air or anything for at least 4 months.
Like an Egyptian mummy.
Like an Egyptian mummy. Oh, a word you must not use. You have not been keeping up. It has colonialist. Haven't you read it? I mean, literally, the Egyptologists have decided it's got colonialist, I can't even say the word, implications. The madness.
The madness, indeed. And what about your mental health going up? Because I don't want to, persist with this victim narrative, because you don't sign up to it. But you did have something of a breakdown, I think, in your early teens.
Yeah, I did.
What happened?
Age 13. Oh, it was just, I couldn't face school. Again, despite my ability and everything else, I'd been to an astonishingly progressive primary school. We forget progressiveness in education starts very early after the Second World War. I went to that school in 1949. I left in 1956. We did have a prize. I won, of course, the main prize. By the way, I won my scripture prize by cheating, but that's an entirely...
Because you are, of course, an atheist. You won it by lying as well.
I am terribly disproud of that. But the main school prize that I won was for, believe it or not, 1956, Environmental Studies. 56. I've still got it. It's the foundation of so much of the history that I write. It's by the Quenelles, Peter, and I forget his wife's name. And what it is, it's called A History of England Through Everyday Things. So it's history through objects, which has been something that I've always been... Nowadays it's called material culture because we need to blow it up. But then, so I had that extraordinary primary school. There were just 2 male teachers. It was, again, very much like now, a feminized environment. And I was an only child of elderly parents and so on, and you suddenly go to a boys' grammar school.
Okay.
And it was a very humane school.
Time for some pop psychology. Was history an escape?
No, I wasn't particularly interested in history at that point. Again, my career, I was at the Oxford Union last night, and I was talking with a couple of other people there, and we'd had very similar experiences. They were historians, but at school, they were interested in the natural sciences. They were interested in physics and chemistry.
So what drew you to history in the end, in the long run?
I suppose my failure to be a natural scientist, let's be honest. I had the great good fortune to, once I got back into the stream of the school, which I did after 6 or 7 months, my class, tiny, there were only 20 odd of us. There were 3 or 4 of us who went to Cambridge out of a class of that size, including 2 myself and another getting open scholarships. And 2 of them were natural mathematicians. One of them, Roger Howarth, he was the kind of person for whom a number had a sound, a colour. And maths just...
So for him it was a very creative endeavour, as well as intellectual.
They were highly impressive in verbal subjects as well. I could not do that with number. I can do it with words.
You can, certainly.
And so for me, I think history, I'm going to make this sound terribly unfortunate, it was a kind of second best. I also had a terrible history master. He was awful. I mean, the sheer shockingness of the teaching dictated notes and whatever, but he did one wonderful thing for which the 2 wonderful things I'm eternally grateful to George Zaire. One of them was, when I was a sixth former, he gave me the use of his own library. And he had a magnificent library. He was a failed Don, in a beautiful room, books perfectly organised. And I swore then I would have one. And it took me 50 years and a Channel 4 contract to be able to afford it. And the other thing that he did, which I think is even more important, my tiny little boys' grammar school was brilliant at drama and brilliant at public speaking and debating. The only time I ever became... We'd had a house system, of course. Grammar schools in those days modelled themselves on public schools. So I was in schoolhouse. You were divided in different houses, which competed at games and everything else. And the only sort of intellectual competition was the public speaking competition, which I invariably won.
Invariably won. Well, look, you've been educating us ever since, and perhaps to a degree you're self-taught as a result of that terrible history teacher.
No, well, maybe you're right. I mean, I think my education really began much earlier than school. And the reason that I talk as I do, despite my background, I was taught you mentioned Channel 4, I was taught by the old BBC. I was really educated by the Home Service, which is where I talk like that. And as a lonely child with relatively elderly parents, my grandfather living with us, for me, the BBC, the world that opened. Another profoundly important influence on me was Arthur Mee's Children's Encyclopedia, most brilliantly constructed. And a final influence was, you were talking about ill health and whatever, which I had a lot of until I was in my late teens, at which point it vanished. Yeah. But I needed a course of infrared treatment. I got a terrible carbuncle, one of these huge, the kind of thing that Prince Charles was frightened about appearing on Trafalgar Square, and it was very nearly as big as Richard Rogers' extension would have been. And I had a wonderful physiotherapist who administered, I've no idea whether the infrared did anything to it at all. And she was one of the typical figures, Women were dominant at that point. We forget this, but they were all unmarried. And there was a very powerful, as I can sense retrospectively, very powerful sense of whiff of lesbianism and all the rest of it. Anyway, massive
I had
woman.
That with the nuns.
Massive woman. Do you know what she did? She gave me a book called 100 Great Lives as I was at my last appointment and my horrible carbuncle popped. And she said, you'll be one of them.
Spectacular. We were at Channel 4 together in the early 2000s. You signed, I think, a 4-year deal worth £2 million. So that was reported.
Do not let us be so vulgar.
I don't remember being on a similar deal for Balls of Steel or my documentaries, but the books are incredible. The TV was incredible. You have shrugged off your brief cancellation with grace, style and panache, and it's great to have you back, and we love your contributions to GB News.
Thank you.
A true hero, Dr. David Starkey.